In this video, we uncover what happened when stupid Karens try climbing Mount Everest. From a Karen who bypassed registration and disappeared into unstable ice alone, to a Karen who stayed in the summit queue as her tank ran dry, only to meet her limit in the most brutal way imaginable. It was April 14th, 2015. Mount Everest rose to 29,032 feet on the border between Nepal and Tibet, the highest peak on Earth. Base camp sat at 17,600 feet, where climbers registered with expedition companies and liaison officers before attempting the summit. Denise Carmichael was 42 years old, an insurance claims adjuster from Scottsdale, Arizona. Her experience consisted of 2 guided day hikes in Sedona and 1 summit of a 10,000-foot peak in Colorado. She had paid for a budget expedition package, but believed the mandatory liaison officer registration was unnecessary bureaucracy designed to generate revenue rather than ensure safety. Everest's routes above base camp required specialized high-altitude equipment and acclimatization. The Khumbu icefall between base camp and Camp 1 was a maze of shifting ice blocks and hidden crevasses. Weather patterns shifted rapidly at extreme altitude, with temperatures well below freezing even during climbing season. Supplemental oxygen became critical above 26,000 feet. Climbers followed fixed rope routes established by climbing teams. A registration tent at base camp processed climbing permits and route assignments. Denise approached the checkpoint and asked about the route. The liaison officer explained the permit system and the requirement to register her climb with her expedition group. She argued that permits were revenue generation schemes. The officer explained that permits helped coordinate rescues and track climber locations on the mountain. Denise's voice grew louder as she insisted she had prepared thoroughly. She stated that she had paid thousands of dollars for the expedition and had a right to climb independently. Other climbers waiting in line watched the exchange. The officer repeated that climbing without proper registration violated regulations and created safety risks. Denise remained at the checkpoint, arms crossed, insisting the policy was unreasonable. After several more minutes of back and forth, she finally turned away and walked toward the tent area. The next morning, she left base camp before dawn without her assigned group. She carried a day pack that appeared too light for a proper attempt through the icefall. Another climber noticed her heading toward the Khumbu icefall alone. She moved quickly, staying away from the main route where teams were working. She followed a less traveled path through the icefall that experienced climbers avoided due to instability. Denise navigated through the ice formations for some time, gaining elevation. The route narrowed as it approached a section where ice blocks towered overhead. She had minimal equipment and no partner for safety. She began crossing a snow bridge over a crevasse. Her right foot broke through the thin snow layer. She lost balance and fell through the surface. She dropped into the crevasse, falling before wedging between ice walls and a narrow shaft. The fall had caused injuries, including a fractured leg and severe bruising to her torso. She tried to climb out, but couldn't manage the smooth ice walls with her injuries. The crevasse was only a few feet wide at her position, with no way to maneuver. She pulled out her phone, but had no signal. She had limited water and some food. No rope, no ice axe, no emergency beacon beyond her phone. The temperature inside the crevasse was well below freezing. She remained wedged in that position. Hours passed. The limited daylight that reached the crevasse faded. Temperature dropped further as darkness came. By the second day, she was shivering uncontrollably. Her movements were slow and uncoordinated from the cold and altitude. She attempted to shift position, but managed only slight movements. The extreme cold continued. She had been without adequate water. Her body was shutting down from hypothermia, shock from the injuries, dehydration, and altitude effects at nearly 19,000 feet. She lost consciousness sometime on the 3rd day. A team working on the fixed ropes spotted the collapsed snow bridge. They investigated and found her in the crevasse. A rescue team reached her location. She had no pulse and was not breathing. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from severe hypothermia, dehydration, shock from untreated injuries, and altitude-related complications. The fractures had caused blood loss and compromised the body's ability to regulate temperature in the extreme cold. Dehydration and the thin air at that elevation had accelerated the decline. The lack of emergency equipment, adequate supplies, and communication devices meant she had no way to signal for help. The death was ruled accidental. Her expedition company reported her missing when she failed to return to base camp. It was May 8, 2016. Mount Everest rose to 29,032 feet on the border between Nepal and Tibet, the highest peak on Earth. Advanced Base Camp on the north side sat at 21,300 feet, where climbers acclimatize before attempting higher camps during the narrow weather windows of climbing season. Valerie Hutchins was 38 years old, a housewife from Boston, Massachusetts. Her husband was a surgeon, and she had arranged childcare for their 2 children specifically for this expedition. Her climbing experience included guided trips to lower altitude peaks during favorable conditions. But she had never climbed above 20,000 feet. She had planned this Everest expedition for over a year as a personal challenge. She viewed weather forecasts with skepticism, believing they were often exaggerated to avoid liability. Everest's upper camps involved extreme altitude and exposure to severe weather. May marked the brief climbing season, but conditions remained unpredictable with sudden storms. Temperatures could drop to -40 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill. The route above Camp 2 crossed exposed terrain with limited shelter. Supplemental oxygen became increasingly important at higher elevations. Equipment failure or exposure at extreme altitude could be fatal within hours. The expedition leader had received weather reports predicting dangerous wind speeds and deteriorating conditions for the upper mountain. Forecasts showed a storm system moving in earlier than the planned weather window. The leader called a meeting the evening before to postpone the move to Camp 3 at 25,000 feet. Valerie argued for over 15 minutes about the decision. The leader explained that conditions exceeded safe parameters for the team. Valerie stated she had arranged her entire schedule around this expedition and had paid significant money. The leader offered to wait for better conditions in several days. Valerie refused, saying this was her only opportunity and that she had already been away from her children for weeks. The next morning before dawn, she left Camp 2 without her team. Other climbers noticed her heading up the route alone. She carried supplemental oxygen, but her pack appeared lighter than recommended. Another climber called out to her about the weather forecast. Valerie responded that forecasts were usually wrong and that she had proper gear. She insisted she knew her capabilities. The other climber returned to his tent. She climbed through the early morning, following the fixed ropes. The first several hours were manageable as she gained elevation. Higher up, wind speeds increased noticeably. She continued upward into more exposed terrain. Valerie reached higher on the route by mid-morning. Cloud cover had moved in and light snow began falling. Wind speeds had increased significantly. She pulled her down suit tighter and continued climbing. Visibility dropped steadily as conditions worsened. She paused at a section of fixed rope to adjust her oxygen mask. Her fingers were becoming clumsy. Despite insulated gloves, she continued for another stretch, gaining more elevation. A particularly strong gust knocked her off balance. She stumbled and fell against rock. Her down suit tore on the exposed edge. Wind began penetrating the damaged section. She stood and tried to continue, but the wind had intensified to dangerous levels. Visibility had decreased to only a few feet. She could barely see the fixed ropes ahead. She attempted to descend, but her coordination was deteriorating. Her movements became increasingly erratic as altitude and cold took their toll. The conditions made it difficult to navigate, even with the fixed lines. She moved slowly, expending energy, and losing body heat through the damaged suit. She began shivering. Snow accumulated on her clothing and equipment. She found a small area behind a rock outcrop and crouched down. The wind still reached her at that elevation. Over the next hours, her shivering decreased as her core temperature dropped. She became lethargic. Her oxygen supply was running low. She attempted to change the cylinder, but her coordination had failed. Her breathing became shallow and irregular. She slumped against the rocks. Her body was found 3 days later by a team moving between camps, located off the main route where she had sheltered. She was partially buried by snow that had accumulated during the storm. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as severe hypothermia, combined with altitude-related complications. The damaged down suit had accelerated heat loss at extreme altitude. She had been inadequately prepared for solo climbing in deteriorating conditions, lacking backup support and sufficient oxygen reserves. Her oxygen system showed she had depleted her supply. The death was determined to be accidental. It was May 19, 2014. Mount Everest rose to 29,032 feet on the border between Nepal and Tibet, the highest peak on Earth. Camp 4 sat at 26,000 feet in the death zone, where climbers made their final preparations before summit attempts during narrow weather windows. Lorraine Vasquez was 45 years old, a dental hygienist from Portland, Oregon. She had paid significant money for a commercial expedition package with a well-known guiding company. Her climbing experience was limited to guided trips on lower altitude peaks. She had trained for over a year, but had never spent extended time above 20,000 feet. She viewed the expedition as a once-in-a-lifetime achievement and had made the expedition a central part of her identity for the past year. Everest's summit push from the South Col required climbers to ascend over 3,000 feet through the death zone, where the human body deteriorates rapidly due to oxygen deprivation. The standard protocol involved leaving Camp 4 around midnight to reach the summit by mid-morning and descend before afternoon weather deteriorated. Turnaround times were strictly enforced regardless of summit success. Climbers who stayed too long at altitude risked exhaustion, disorientation, and being caught descending in darkness. The descent was statistically more dangerous than the ascent, requiring full concentration and remaining in energy reserves. The expedition leader conducted a briefing at Camp 4 the evening before the summit push. He emphasized the turnaround time of 1 p.m., regardless of position on the mountain. Lorraine made a dismissive comment about having come too far to turn back early, and that she hadn't paid this much money to follow arbitrary time limits. Lorraine reached the summit at 12:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the turnaround time. The guide said they needed to begin descending. Lorraine pulled out her phone and camera. She began taking photos and videos. The guide reminded her of the turnaround time. Lorraine said she needed more time after everything she had been through. The guide explained they needed to leave immediately to descend safely before dark. Lorraine argued that 15 minutes wouldn't matter. She continued taking photos from different angles. Other climbers from different expeditions were also on the summit, creating congestion. The guide's voice became firm as he stated they were leaving now. Lorraine responded that she had paid for this experience and deserved time to enjoy it. She mentioned the money she had invested and said she would leave negative reviews if she was rushed. By the time Lorraine agreed to descend, over half an hour had passed. The guide was visibly concerned as they began the descent. The route down was slow due to other climbers. By the time they reached the south summit, Lorraine's pace had slowed noticeably. The guide stayed close to her, monitoring her condition. As they descended further, Lorraine began stopping more frequently. Her movements became sluggish. The guide asked if she was okay. She said she was just tired. By late afternoon, they were still well above safe elevation. Daylight was fading. The guide radioed for additional support. Lorraine sat down on the snow and said she needed to rest. The guide tried to get her moving, explaining that stopping in the death zone was dangerous. Lorraine's responses became slower and less coherent. She was showing signs of severe exhaustion and altitude effects. The guide attempted to help her stand, but she couldn't maintain her balance. Her oxygen supply was running low. The guide shared his oxygen with her, but his own supply was also limited. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped further. Another guide from a different expedition reached their position and assisted. They tried to move Lorraine downward, but she could no longer coordinate her movements. She slumped against the slope. Her breathing became shallow. The guides continued efforts to revive her and move her, but she became unresponsive. Despite continued rescue efforts through the night, she did not regain consciousness. Her body was found the next morning by a descending team, located on the route above the balcony where she had collapsed. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from exhaustion and exposure in the death zone, complicated by altitude effects and oxygen depletion. The extended time at extreme altitude, combined with the physical demands of the climb and descent, had depleted her body's reserves. The delay in beginning the descent had left insufficient time and energy to reach safety before darkness and extreme cold set in. Evidence, including radio communications and witness statements, established that she had exceeded the turnaround time and spent excessive time on the summit despite warnings. The death was ruled accidental. Don't miss the next episode. Subscribe now to see what happens when Karens face nature's ultimate reality check. It was May 11th, 2017. Mount Everest rose to 29,032 feet on the border between Nepal and Tibet, the highest peak on Earth. At Camp 2 in the western CWM, climbers rested in their tents at 21,000 feet, preparing for rotations to higher camps. Shelby Fairchild was 51 years old, a grandmother and part-time yoga instructor from Greenwich, Connecticut. She had recently become a grandmother and wanted to prove she was still capable of major physical achievements. She had paid significant money for a guided Everest expedition using inheritance funds. Her climbing experience included guided trips to Kilimanjaro and a failed attempt on Aconcagua. where she had turned back due to altitude sickness. She was fit for her age but had never spent extended time above 20,000 feet. She viewed the expedition as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and was determined to be the grandmother who summited Everest. Everest's extreme altitude created severe physiological challenges. Above 21,000 feet, the body deteriorated rapidly. Oxygen levels were a fraction of sea level. Altitude sickness could progress from mild symptoms to life-threatening conditions within hours. High-altitude pulmonary edema involved fluid accumulation in the lungs, causing breathing difficulty and chest tightness. The only effective treatment was rapid descent to lower elevation. Supplemental oxygen provided temporary relief, but was not a substitute for descent. Climbers needed to carry their own equipment and maintain self-sufficiency even with guide support. The expedition had spent weeks acclimatizing through rotations between camps. Shelby had complained of headaches for multiple days, but insisted they were tension headaches from stress. The lead guide conducted daily health checks. At Camp 2, Shelby's oxygen saturation was measured below the normal range for that altitude. She had developed a persistent dry cough. The guide recommended descending to base camp for rest and monitoring. Shelby refused, stating she was on a schedule and needed to continue upward to Camp 3. She had been asking guides to carry portions of her gear since lower camps. The guides explained that each climber needed to manage their own equipment for safety and self-sufficiency. Shelby argued that she had paid for a premium service and expected accommodation. She stated that carrying equipment was what guides were for. The guides explained that at extreme altitude, each person needed to be self-sufficient. Shelby became irritated and mentioned the significant amount of money she had invested in the expedition. By evening, Shelby's cough had worsened, and she was breathing more rapidly than normal. She had difficulty sleeping despite supplemental oxygen. The next morning, the guide strongly recommended she descend immediately to base camp. Shelby refused, saying she hadn't paid thousands of dollars to turn back. She insisted the symptoms were minor and would improve with rest. The guide explained that her symptoms indicated possible pulmonary edema and that continuing upward could be fatal. Shelby became angry and accused them of trying to end the expedition early. She threatened to leave negative reviews and contact the company owner. After extensive discussion, the guides made the decision to begin descending with her, explaining they would not allow her to continue upward in this condition. The descent began mid-morning. Shelby moved slowly, stopping frequently. Her breathing was labored, and she was coughing more frequently. As they descended through the western WM toward base camp, she was coughing up small amounts of pink, frothy fluid. The guides increased the pace of descent. Shelby's breathing became increasingly difficult. Her lips had a bluish tint. She stopped and sat down in the snow. The guides administered supplemental oxygen from the emergency supply. They helped her to her feet and supported her weight as they continued descending. Her cough produced more pink froth. As they continued lower, her breathing had become a wet, gurgling sound. She could no longer walk, even with support. The guides radioed ahead for assistance. Additional team members came up from base camp with a rescue sled. Her consciousness was fading. Her breathing became irregular and gasping. The guides placed her on the sled and began moving her downward as quickly as possible. She stopped breathing. They performed resuscitation efforts while continuing to descend toward base camp. She remained unresponsive. They confirmed death after extended efforts. The medical examiner's report listed the cause of death as high-altitude pulmonary edema. The lungs had filled with fluid, preventing oxygen from entering the bloodstream. Contributing factors included inadequate acclimatization response, refusal to descend despite early symptoms, and delayed descent when symptoms became severe. The examiner noted that pulmonary edema was reversible with prompt descent, and that her death could likely have been prevented if she had descended when first advised. The delay had allowed the condition to progress beyond recovery. It was May 23, 2015. Mount Everest rose to 29,032 feet on the border between Nepal and Tibet, the highest peak on Earth. The Hillary step at 28,839 feet marked one of the final technical obstacles before the summit, where climbers queued on fixed ropes during busy weather windows. Heather Brooke was 33 years old, an accountant from San Francisco, California. She had planned this expedition as the culmination of years of training and saving. Her climbing fitness was good, and she had completed several high-altitude climbs on other mountains. She believed she could move efficiently through the summit push and handle the challenges of the death zone. Everest's summit push required climbers to navigate through the death zone above 26,000 feet. where the human body could not survive for extended periods. The Hillary Step was a near vertical rock face requiring climbers to ascend and descend using fixed ropes. Traffic jams at the step were common during peak season, causing dangerous delays. Climbers waiting in the death zone depleted oxygen supplies and energy reserves. Frostbite, exhaustion, and oxygen deprivation could occur rapidly during delays. The expedition leader briefed the team at Camp 4 before the summit push. He explained that if traffic was heavy at the Hillary Step, they might need to turn around to avoid dangerous delays. Heather listened but made a comment about not turning back after coming this far. Another climber mentioned that waiting in line at altitude could be fatal. Heather cut him off, saying she had been planning this for years and that she could handle the wait. She added that this was her only chance and she wasn't wasting it. The team left Camp 4 after midnight. Heather climbed steadily through the darkness, using supplemental oxygen and following the fixed ropes. Progress was slow in the extreme altitude. By mid-morning, they reached the Hillary Step. A long line of climbers from multiple expeditions was queued on the ropes. The guide estimated a significant wait. The guide gathered the team and recommended they turn around due to the delay. Heather refused. She said she had come too far to turn back now. The guide explained that waiting would deplete their oxygen and energy, making the descent dangerous. Heather argued that she had enough oxygen and could manage. Other team members agreed to descend, but Heather insisted on staying. The guide reluctantly agreed to wait with her, but emphasized they would need to move quickly once through. Heather waited in line at the Hillary Step for an extended period. The temperature was well below zero. She stood clipped to the fixed rope, barely moving. Her oxygen supply was depleting steadily. Her extremities were becoming numb despite insulated gear. Finally, she reached the base of the step and began ascending the near vertical section. She summited after the extended delay. She spent several minutes on top, taking photos despite the guides urging to descend immediately. By the time they began descending, her oxygen supply was running low. She changed to her reserve cylinder. The descent back to the Hillary Step took longer than expected. Heather's movements had slowed noticeably. When they reached the step, another queue had formed for the descent. Climbers were backed up, waiting to descend the fixed ropes. The guide's concern was evident. Heather's oxygen ran out while waiting. She began using the guide's emergency supply. Her coordination deteriorated rapidly without adequate oxygen. When her turn came to descend the step, her movements were clumsy and slow. Partway down the vertical section, she lost her footing. Her weight came onto the fixed rope and safety system. She hung suspended, unable to regain her footing on the near vertical surface. The guide above tried to assist but couldn't reach her position safely. Other climbers helped lower her the rest of the way down the step. She was barely conscious. Her breathing was shallow and irregular. The guide and other climbers attempted to move her downward, but she could no longer coordinate her movements. She collapsed on the route below the Hillary Step. Despite efforts to revive her and administer oxygen from other climbers' supplies, she did not regain consciousness. She died on the route in the death zone. Her body remained on the mountain. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from severe hypoxia and exhaustion in the death zone. The extended delay at the Hillary Step had depleted her oxygen supply and energy reserves. The lack of supplemental oxygen at extreme altitude had caused rapid deterioration of brain and organ function. Contributing factors included the decision to wait in the queue, despite warnings and extended time in the death zone without adequate oxygen. The death was ruled accidental. Thanks for watching. If you like these stories, click here.